do 4 slides of this. And okay, cool. I got people coming. So basically, practical object-oriented design. You guys, if you've read the first few chapters, you kind of got the gist of it. But it's all about. That's me. This is from my talk at the meetup. So at that time, I only had 10 months of experience, and actually, I'll mention that later. So yeah, in Orlando, it's Ruby Newbies is the site. This is the old site. We actually updated it to a new site, and I think I'm sharing my screen for the benefit of people who are watching this after the fact that maybe haven't been in the Slack. The site's completely different now, and it's all a Slack chat, and the images take forever to load. Awesome. So yeah, so what to expect. So basically to talk about programming, questions and design and object-oriented programming. This is another slide. I had a joke that I said then, but that's what the book looks like. So basically, so POODR, or practical object-oriented design in Ruby. It's definitely not a beginner level topic, but it is a beginner level topic, if that makes any sense, because it's actually good to know in the beginning of your learning as you start building out projects that are bigger than small katas or small little even problems like in plain Ruby, doing like tic-tac-toe and doing a game of life. I found that this actually helps because it helps you structure your code properly. And before I hit record, Jeff, you were talking about doing like testing, and towards the end of this book, it actually goes into testing and tells you why test, and it actually helps you structure your code better. And a lot of the things about test-driven development that a lot of the Rubyists talk about is that it helps you design your code better. But one of the things that actually is mentioned in the beginning of the book, actually in the first chapter, is about how painful programming is. Because the problem is, as you program, certain things get stuck, and you kind of get stuck in a rut as far as like how this rabbit's running around the feet of this person. When you go to change something, everything could possibly break because for some reason, like your code could be deeply coupled into each other, which I do have an example coming up. And like I said, this is a talk I did before so I'm going quickly through it. We can talk more in detail about it once I finish the next slide, which will be the last slide. But here I've got a class, and it's a dog, and the dog can speak a language. And if the language is actually English, so you guys are probably familiar, but for people who aren't familiar, what's happening here is I've got a method inside of the dog, so that way the dog can actually call dog.speak. I've got the dog object here, and then you can pass in the dog language, which is here. So if the language is English, the dog will say howdy, and if it's not English, then it'll just say wolf. So basically, that's an example of an object. Ruby is an object-oriented programming language, so a lot of this happens. You'll see a lot of this happening over and over again. Even in Rails, you'll see stuff shoved in the modules and classes. So I didn't look at the slide. How can designing object-oriented? Oh, how hard can it be? So the answer is pretty hard. As far as getting into larger scale projects, I guess the answer would be hard. And that's basically it. I think this starts getting into more of the chapter 2 to 5. So now, rather than going through all these slides, I'd rather just talk about the book. And we can kind of get more into the discussion. And actually, I'll switch over to, so I'm not the only one not doing video. Cool. Okay, awesome. So, did you guys, I think a lot of people actually already had the book to start with. How did you guys all read the first chapter, first 15 pages, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so I guess before I start going through like some of the highlights of the book, does anybody, I know you guys are both in Block, right? You guys both mentioned that. So you guys have both built Rails and stuff.
Yep.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So my question was going to be, have you guys built any like large scale apps? And which large scale meaning probably a Rails app. So the answer probably most likely would be yes.
Mm-hmm.
So what I found personally, so when I started my job today, actually at this company, Izia is where I work.
Congratulations.
Um, yeah, when I started working at this company, their app was already a year into existence, so there was a lot of code that was already established. So the problem was right when I figured it out, this was like maybe 2 months after I finished Block, I got a job working with IZEA. I found that working in legacy code and working with code that's already been established is very painful for the fact that, for one, if there's not test, stuff can break very easily and silently. So you could change one thing thinking you've done a great job on something, but it's possible that what you change could actually break everything. For example, if you're familiar with translations, with the international standard translations files. Um, Basically, you instead of writing actual strings in your application, in your template data, you could actually do a path to a YAML file to then translate that to English or Spanish or French or whatever you want to do. So part of my app actually that just broke yesterday was due to because someone changed the translation file, and when I went to go ahead and pull down the actual project down and bring in all their code, they broke some of my translations because my translations were coupled on that string, and since it was broken, it obviously I had to go ahead and go backwards and fix. That's a small thing that was coupled, which is not that bad, which I guess could be a not a good example. I guess another example that I ran into was one of the first things I did was implementing the Twitter gem. Previous to that, we didn't actually have a gem for Twitter to parse in, like get all the REST data from it. So I guess I guess I'm trying to explain what I did, but I have to kind of explain what my company does first. So what we do is we actually connect bloggers and tweeters to big companies, our brands, so that way they can get social media sponsorship on their Twitter accounts or blogs. So part of my first task was actually to implement someone being able to send a photo from our platform to Twitter. And to do that, I had to add the Twitter gem. But the problem was we didn't have the Twitter gem. Someone built a handmade, what do you call it? Like an initializer. The term is escaping from me, but or an API. So they built an actual internal API for our app that was hand built based on what Twitter was giving us. But the problem with that was once I added photos to that code base in our app, everything broke for actually sending regular Twitter statuses. So the problem was everything was so coupled together very tightly that when I tried to add something on top of it, everything broke. So what I'm getting at is, so the idea of object-oriented programming is to avoid those horrible design practices of making sure that one thing works and one thing works very well, but rather trying to build a component that works well, that future-proofs. And did I explain that right? I kind of felt like I was just talking circles for the sake of talking in the circles.
Made sense to me.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Cool. So, so having design, man, I actually heard of a really good example earlier today about design and how well it does, but I can't remember it. I should have wrote that down too. But yeah, I definitely am looking forward to going through this book again. Mainly, the first chapter is all about talking about object-oriented design and object-oriented programming, and how you can pass around. One of the examples that reoccurs in the book is actually about a bike,
Mm-hmm.
and how the bike. We'll probably talk about this later, but in a future session. But with the bike, you could build a bike, like have a bike class, and then from inheriting that class, you could build a new model called mountain bike. So if you guys are familiar with inheritance, I would inherit everything that I know from a bike in the mountain bike. So that way I can just add my extra few pieces, let's say gears or another set of gears or different tires. But the problem is if a bike changes, so let's say if we had a bike and we needed to make a, let's see, what was the difference? I think I might be going too far ahead, but yeah, to be able to build a bike and make sure that the bike is inherited against, actually that was an example. So the example actually was instead of having a bike class, it was actually building the bike on the fly. So you had the gear, you had all the parts of the bike that was inheriting into the actual bike model. So you had gears and wheels and all these different fixtures of a bike. And the problem was if the wheel changed, it would break the actual bike class. And the idea of it was trying to create a design in practice that would be able to future-proof the building of a mountain bike or the building of a fixie bike or the building of a tricycle, to be able to build stuff very easily. So going back to my first example, what I was doing with Isaiah and doing the Twitter photo, one of the things that we did to future-proof the code that I made was actually create a photo module. So rather than Twitter class that was able to make tweets, and then I made a Twitter photo class that was able to make Twitter photo tweets. But the problem with that is it wasn't very future-proof. So when we added Instagram, we've got the same code that's happening in Twitter photo as we have in Instagram. So rather we created a module that was called photo module, and everything that was specific to photos, like uploading photos and then sending them to Amazon, that would go in the photo module. So rather than create all this duplicating our efforts in Instagram and then also Twitter and then eventually Facebook, because everybody can send photos. You just include a module called photo module, so all that uploading and photo handling was happening in the module, and it makes the code less coupled together. And also, there's another principle called don't repeat yourself that we were able to implement by not repeating code and just including a module, which I will have an example for you guys in the future of how that worked, rather than just talking about it. So with that being said, that's all I have as far as explanations and presentation. I want to try to avoid doing long-winded presentations in the beginning and do more of like a talking about like questions as far as not even just this book, but in Ruby in general. If you guys had questions about, I don't know, if Jeff, if you had more questions about testing, maybe I could help you down a path of learning that even better.
Okay. Well, sure. I could go ahead. So it's okay to kind of wander a little bit outside the chapter 1?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Okay. Well, so this is maybe not something that's specifically covered in the book, but I guess maybe a few questions that I still have that I'm a little unclear with. You know, so when you're starting out, you know, the decision to use whether a module or a class, and I think I've slowly kind of put some stuff together so that I have an understanding, but I kind of want to just, you know, maybe run this by you to see if there are any holes in my understanding. And so a module is basically a class that you can't instantiate, right? You can make an instance from a class, but you can't make an instance from a module. And so you were talking about you built some sort of module where you could share this behavior. And so, you know, I guess basically from what I'm understanding, you use modules to kind of like group together behaviors that other classes will use. Because, you know, Ruby and most languages have the limitation of having the single inheritance situation, right? And so the way that Ruby gets around that is using modules. And then, so whenever you create a module, you're putting all this behavior in there that can be shared by different classes, and then that's when you basically add the ABL at the end, the ABLE, right? So like the enumerable is a module. So I guess, you know, maybe a good question is, would I see a class that ends in ABLE is that a module? Like, can that always be a module? And would you ever use a module and not have it in with ABLE? You know, for example, like I think you alluded to this earlier, where, and I've seen this in Ruby Gems too, right? Where you start out designing a Ruby gem and you kind of wrap everything in a module, and I think that that's more for namespacing things, you know, just so you don't have namespace collisions. But I don't know, maybe, so sorry, I'm kind of wandering with this question, but maybe to bring it together, like when you start fresh and stuff, like what is sort of, what goes through your mind when you you know, when you start building something out and you have to decide whether to use a module or a class, or how do you use those two together?
So usually what I do, and this is not usually the practice of most people, I know most people try to avoid this, but like just even like how we struggle to even form our questions in this group, I usually will just do the easiest way first, and if something looks wrong, then I start moving towards a different direction. So, for example, if I knew I needed to make a Twitter photo class, and I needed to make sure that this Twitter photo needed to have photo methods basically methods within there, I would just start writing it out. If I didn't think that far ahead, it'd be like think of a photo module to include, or in Rails they call them concerns. Also, just another side note. So creating these modules or concerns, I would just start writing code, literally. And once it starts looking like a big mess, for example, one of the things that I skipped over in my presentation, which I'll bring up here, is in the book. It's not even in the book. It's once I find this, there's some rules that Sandy Metz had got into on the Ruby Rogues podcast about I think it was about a year ago. I'm not sure. I think the book maybe might be a year old, or might be 2013. But regardless, some rules for design that she came up with, because her issue was she didn't want to come up with hard, fast rules that everybody would stick to, but the community wanted rules for them to just go by as far as a guideline. So she ended up coming with rules anyway. So one of the rules that she came up with, and this is kind of moving into the answer of your question, but a class shouldn't have more than 100 lines. Classes should only do one thing. So, for example, if my class is it's a Twitter class, so I want to post a tweet, and then I've also got Twitter actually doing other things like parsing data and preparing photo sizes and re-rendering things. That might be a red flag for you to start thinking about a module, to start putting some of that code into a module, and then including that module later. Another thing is methods should only be 5 lines. So if you've got a tweet method for your Twitter, and I keep alluding to Twitter just because that's the example I spend so much time in. If you have a Twitter method that's just sending a tweet, but it's 100 lines long because it's preparing the tweet and it's messing around with strings and stuff like that, it might be another red flag to maybe abstract some of that code into a separate method or a separate concern to be passed into that method later. So then also pass no more than 5 arguments. Params an argument. Controllers can only instantiate one object. So if you have a tweet controller, you shouldn't have a photo uploader object in your tweet controller. And also views can only know about one instance variable. That one's kind of hard, especially if you have users and then you have users doing stuff. Sometimes that doesn't happen. But these aren't hard, fast rules. These are more of like guidelines. So if you have, obviously, if you're going to have a class that has 100 lines or 1,000 lines, then obviously there might be some opportunity for refactoring into a module. So that's kind of I don't know what happened to my camera. Oh, here I am. So yeah, so going back to like knowing when you're starting out a project, or knowing when to actually start looking into modules as far as extracting code. Usually if you're going to 100 lines, or you're starting a class that's starting to do a couple different unique things, then it might be an idea to start abstracting things into a module. Because the issue is, like, so going back to the bike, if you're building a bike that has gears and you're a bike that has that needs to know about gears and cranks and brakes and all this other stuff, it might be a good idea to maybe build a bike class, but then also include bike parts as a module. So that way you can pick and choose your parts that you need to do, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that way you can easily make different kinds of bikes in the future. So you're not stuck to having just a bike class that has all these parts that are added to it. But you can have a bike class that includes bike parts, and you have a mountain bike class that includes bike parts.
Mm-hmm.
And you can pick and choose your parts that you need.
And is that where we start kind of getting into composition a little bit?
Yeah. Composition would be that. So your composition of to be able, it's like I think they talk about assembly line and being able to pick up that module and be able to just include it somewhere to be able to create stuff off the fly.
Cool.
So it's something easier to be done in practice rather than talking about it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
I know after I read this book the first time when I first started this job, I was on a feature. I don't remember what the feature was, but there was so much opportunity for me to refactor, and I noticed it like right off the bat, just because I had just finished this book, and I was like, oh crap, I didn't do this and didn't do that, and there's so much opportunity, and like that pull request that I did had like the least amount of comments, just because the code was so clean. So hopefully, if I read this again, my pull request will be much better.
Well, I think you make a good point too, and that at the beginning, sometimes you just don't know, right? So you just have to start building, and if you are using these, Sandy Metz's rules, where you've got these, very short, succinct classes and methods, then, that's the whole idea, right? Is kind of keeping them very compact, so that if you get to a point where you realize that these will easily split off into two classes, they're not going to be highly coupled, and so they can split off. And I guess sometimes you don't know, so you just make sure they're loosely coupled, and you put them all into one class to begin with, and just kind of see where it goes from there.
Well, basically,
that's kind of usually my approach anyway. But yeah.
I'm going to interject here. It's Farish. Sorry, no camera in my office. Hey. Mess. Look,
no problem.
One thing I was going to say about what you just said, sometimes you just have to dive in and mess everything up to figure it out. And that's one of the best things you can do. 4 or 5 years ago, I built an iPhone app, and it was actually harder back then because they had like garbage collection, stuff like that. And the only way I actually pushed myself was I literally spent a weekend, drank some Jack Daniels, and programmed the whole weekend. I told leave me alone, wife, do this, that. And by the end of the weekend, I had a working tip app. It was actually better than a lot of the apps out there, but I didn't market it. I just did it for myself. I published it, put it on the App Store, and then I stopped. But it takes some diving in, because you're not out to, we're at the point right now as beginners, you're not out to impress anybody. You're out to figure this out and make it work. And it might not be the best, but if you make it work, or if you understand it, gets you farther ahead than the person who didn't try.
Yes.
Yeah,
that's very true. So I recently just took the plunge into Ember, which is a front-end framework, for the reason that I needed to learn something else besides Rails, and to increase my career path. So I ended up taking on a project. I'm part of another organization called Steamrollers, basically creating a voice for minorities and women in tech, and started a project for them that I had on my list of things to do is make an Ember app. But for the longest time, I just never had I had ideas, but it's never had the initiative to follow through. So I ended up throwing together an Ember app, and just recently finished it on Monday morning, which was quite the feat. But if I didn't have like not the initiative, but the driving force to actually finish it, because I told them I would, I probably wouldn't have finished it. But I literally just started throwing stuff together, and there's some things that could be better with the app, which hopefully this weekend I'm going to get into testing with Ember. But yeah, it's just something that no matter what you do, if it's iOS or if it's Android or if it's Rails, you definitely have to do it. And then another thing is like testing. Testing helps to design an app. It helps you get stuff started. But a lot of times I find, like even when I first started doing testing, I found that I would start testing like the most meaningless things. I would just to write another test for the sake of writing another test. And chapter 9 in this book gets into that as far as testing with a purpose rather than just testing for testing. Once I read that, I realized what I was doing was wrong, and I ended up fixing that behavior. But yeah, writing test with a purpose and understanding what the reason for that test is. If you're trying to start an app from scratch, just write enough tests to get the app from scratch to start working, and then move forward. Because a lot of times you can get stuck in test land and think that you just need more and more tests, and it's definitely not needed. And also same thing as testing, you can get deeply coupled into your tests. Your tests could be looking for certain things that you don't need to look for. Not realizing it, you start getting stuck into making sure these tests always pass when at the end of the day, maybe you just need to delete that line of the test. And that's a hard thing to know when to do, but when you get stuck on a test for as long as a week trying to figure out how it works, one of the options might be actually deleting the test, which is crazy, but yeah, she mentions that. Mm-hmm. Tommy, you did throw in the Bike Shed podcast. Episode 1, yeah, that's right. They did go through the Sandy Metz rules, and they talk about them in pretty good detail.
Yeah, that's another. I think it's a ThoughtBot podcast. So.
Yeah, that's a good podcast too. They actually go more detail about Rails. Sorry, we didn't get that.
Sorry, I started playing the podcast. I was trying to link it and it started playing. Sorry.
Oh. Okay. Yeah, I almost think that maybe we should. Once we get closer to finishing the book, it might be fun to start a group project. Maybe Rails might be easiest, or we could do Ruby or whatever. But maybe we just think in the back of our mind if anybody has an idea of an app to build, and we can maybe work on it together and start pointing out problems and as far as using the Sandy Metz rules and then keeping those intact. But yeah, maybe towards the end when we start getting closer to testing and stuff like that, it might be helpful. Nothing huge, just something small we can just throw together, and if anybody has time, just throw more code to it, and then we can all do pull requests and kind of like get feedback live. Cool. Also, on that note, if anybody wants me to review their app, I'd be more than happy if you want to drop a link in the book club and to say code to review per, the POODR Book or whatever. I would love to review anybody's app if they don't mind me reviewing it, and just look for anything that could be refactored as far as what we learned through the book. I'm sure I have an app out there that I could probably throw out to you guys if you want to review one of mine. I've got too many apps.
No such thing.
No such thing. I think repos that are mine on GitHub, I think I have to double check that number, but I just basically, GitHub's my Dropbox for code. I just push it up. I'm on my 3rd computer since I've started learning code, so right before I switch computers, I push everything to GitHub and then don't think about it anymore.
Hey, it means you're building things, so that's how you grow, that's how you learn.
Really, it is. I've learned so much more, even in the last few months, just building random projects from scratch. So definitely.
Yeah, reading books and everything, it's good to get basically, I think at the end of the first chapter they talk about theory, and then it doesn't really matter if you're not practicing. And if you stay in the just learning stage, you're never gonna get to the next level. So.
No, and you know what? That was one of my issues. I kind of ran away from the subject, and I have a pretty good career, and I regret running away from the subject. I hate that I ran away because since I was a little boy, I always wanted to do this, and always something got in the way, and I finally last year said I had enough. And you got to just build stuff. So it's one of those big things that it can become your biggest holdback just by not doing.
Yeah, it's very true. Cool. So for the sake of the recording, I'll stop this now.